You're listening to the Hello World podcast, number 26. My name is Sean Wildermuth, and I'm your host. The Hello World podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got started in this business. We go way back to their first computer, their first code experience, and their first job. Today on the show is Laurent Bugnion. He is a senior director at Identity Mine, one of the leading companies and gold partner for Microsoft technologies such as Windows Presentation Foundation, Silverlight, PixelSense, Windows 8, Windows Phone, Xbox, and general user experience. In October 2010, his book Silverlight 4 Unleashed was published and was an advanced sequel to his Silverlight 2 Unleashed book that was published in October 2008. In 2014, he celebrated his 8th year as a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional, as well as his 2nd year as a Microsoft Regional Director. He's also the author of a well-known open-source framework called MVVM Lite for Windows Phone, Windows 8, WPF, and Silverlight. He is based in Zurich, Switzerland, where he lives with his wife and 2 daughters. Laurent and I have been in the same circles for a long time, especially back when I was doing a lot more Silverlight work. His MVVM Lite project was really critical in a lot of the projects I did as well as the courses I taught. I was really excited to get his view of what it's like to be a software developer outside the United States, as well as his interesting story of how he ended up as a software developer when he wanted to be an airplane pilot. Let's take a listen. I'm really happy to welcome Laurent Bugnion to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you, and really looking forward to the discussion with you, man.
Yeah, and you're in Zurich right now?
That is correct.
And that's where you live.
Outside of Zurich. Yeah, that's where I live. I come actually from the western side of Switzerland, so from the French-speaking side. But I moved in Zurich in 1995 already, so I've been here for a while now.
Oh, nice. Though I'm pretty sure that isn't your legal address seat 19A on a plane someplace? Because you're always on the move.
Well, last year was a little bit crazy, and so I decided this year that I'm going to submit less at conferences, and hopefully with that move, I'm going to be home more. Honestly, it was not really. I mean, I'm home a lot because when I'm home, I actually work from home.
Oh, nice.
So I get to spend a lot of time with my kids, which is really nice. But last year, I noticed in December, and I had to go out again for a conference, which was actually a good conference. But I noticed that I had to push myself a little bit, and so I thought, okay, now it's when you are tired of travel, it means you travel too much, so you need to reduce a little bit. Yeah,
absolutely. And you said you come from the west or the French speaking part of Switzerland. Is that around Geneva, Lucerne, or where?
So the city I come from is called Lausanne. It's a town which is on the Lake of Geneva, which we don't like to call it that because it's actually our lake. It's not the Geneva people lake, it's so we call it Lake Lemu, right?
I did not know that.
Yeah. So seriously, it's a nice town. It's not a big town. It's in size, it's probably around 200,000 people, something like that. I spent about 25 years there, and then I thought, okay, I'm probably I want to move somewhere else and see something a little bit bigger. And Zurich is just nice for me because it's quite a lot bigger than my hometown, than my the place where I grew up. But at the same time, it's still Swiss, and so it's still not too big and not too crazy. So I really like it here. It's very nice.
Oh, that's nice. I actually have a friend who's teaches at the college at in your hometown. So I'm hoping to visit her when I get over there later this year.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm looking forward to show you around as well.
Oh, that'd be wonderful. So when did you get started with computers? Did you have one as a kid and sort of the canonical, geek in his room with floppy drives and all that?
Not at all. Actually, I have kind of an unusual path to computing, I would say, in the sense that the story is a lot of of luck and unlucks, which later turned to luck. So it's actually interesting. The thing is, as a child, I wanted to be a professional pilot,
nice.
And that was always, as long as I can remember, that was what I wanted to do. And so the unluck being that I turned to be a software engineer instead, the luck being that I actually love to be a software engineer. So that's kind of the short story. But basically, the way it went is that as a child, I was not very good in math and physics and all that. And you have to choose a path in high school relatively early in Switzerland, at least in those days. And when I had to choose, basically math was, impossible for me. So the scientific path, like we used to name it, was no good for me. So I decided to go into classical studies instead, and I studied Latin for about 9 years, I think.
Wow.
I studied German, French, and English. So basically, some literature and cultural things. And we, of course, had math and physics and all that, but not as much as, people in the scientific path. And so for us, computing was really not a concern much, I would say. The first computer I touched, I was in what we used to call gymnasium or gymnase in French, which is really a kind of a pre-university. And it was actually an Apple Macintosh. And I used it mostly to write, actually, because I was writing quite a lot back then, and texts and stuff that were going into my mind and all kinds of things.
Sure.
So I was using that really as an advanced writing machine. The funny thing is that back then, when I was thinking, okay, what should I do if I cannot be a pilot? I actually wanted to be a graphic designer. So was my thing. And I was always, calligraphing stuff and drawing, lettering and things like that. So it was kind of a passion.
That actually makes a lot of sense in where I know you from.
Yeah, it's actually, like I said, right, I was lucky in my unluck, and it turned out actually pretty okay, because I end up working with graphic designer all day long now, and being very interested into pixel perfection and all that. So it's probably it has its root into that, but definitely the computing thing came out actually quite a lot later. And in fact, the first PC we had at home, my father bought it from a friend that he had, and it was actually an old DOS box, and I having used only Apple Macintosh before, I didn't really know what to do with that.
Right.
I just remembered that I think it was the hard drive was like 20 megabytes or something like that. I mean, it was really a super old box. And so the first thing I started up, and I was probably around 16 or 17 at the time, I think. I started up, and then I check C, and I see a whole lot of files, and I thought, okay, it's probably the guy who actually left it, right? And so it's his old files. So I just deleted everything, and it worked actually okay until I rebooted, of course. And of course, when I rebooted, it said, no system or whatever it said at the time. So I was really, a really big Dumbo with computers back then, and especially not very friendly computers like the DOS computers,
of
right?
Course.
So later, what happened is that I finished my pre-university, and then I thought, okay, what do I do now? I still want to be a pilot. I'm not sure what to do. I just decided to take a break, so I went to travel around the world with a backpack. So it was just before my 18th birthday, I think. And when I came back, I went to see a counselor, and the lady told me, well, if you want to be a pilot, maybe a good path is to be an engineer. Have you considered that? And I was like, well, yeah, sure, but I'm not good in maths, right? And she said, well, it's not that you're not good, it's that you are basically in the wrong path, right?
Right.
In school. And so I considered it, and I thought, well, I might as well give it a try. And so I went into, in Switzerland, we have all kinds of bridges between schools, right? So even if you finish something which is more on the cultural side, like I did, or classical studies side, like I did, you can always find a bridge and go back to the scientific side. And so I did that, and it was a year of working with a lot of electricity, a lot of circuits drawing and circuits calculation, and also a lot of manual work actually. So it was kind of putting us back in line with the people who did the canonical way of entering the engineer school.
Sure.
And after that, I entered the engineer school, which was not a university. It's so here in Switzerland we have those schools that we call in German it's called Technische Fachhochschule. It's really how should I say it's a university, but which is not really following the classical way of that universities work, with big auditoriums and 100 people attending a lesson and a doctor in the middle telling his course. In those schools, and especially the one I went to, it was actually pretty nice for me because it was smaller classes, a lot of labs, a lot of practical work, and at the end I ended up being an electrical engineer really. So that was my first formation.
Yeah, they call them technical schools here, where they're I guess they're really focused on skills rather than sort of the rounded education. Is that the idea?
I think that the idea, it's more of so we are all engineers, but we are really, the people from the technical schools are more practical engineers, while the others are more theoretical engineers. Sure. And in the end, it was all leveled, especially when the whole European Union started and all that. So basically, the paper I have is equivalent to a bachelor.
Oh, nice.
But I had to do an equivalency to get that, basically. And mostly the equivalency was around languages and stuff like that. So
that makes sense.
Not a big deal for me, but it was definitely something I had to do. So that was a start of my scientific career, I would say. And while I was in the engineer school, I actually passed all the selection to enter the commercial pilot school that Swissair back then had.
Oh, nice.
In Zurich. And I passed everything, but unfortunately, Swissair, as you know, maybe went bankrupt. So basically, they pretty much went down, right? Not literally speaking, but figuratively,
right.
Thankfully. And there was a lot of drama around that. There was one famous day, or rather infamous day, where the whole fleet of Swissair was grounded because they didn't have money to pay for fuel, and so they couldn't fly anymore.
Wow.
So that's horrifying. And so as a prequel to that story of the grounding of Swissair, they started by pretty much closing the school in front of me. So something like 2 months before I had to enter the class, having my name on the desk and everything, pretty much, they closed it for budgetary reasons.
Wow.
And so it was kind of a shock, obviously, but at the same time, to be honest, I was not totally unhappy because when I was in engineer school, I just discovered that I love science, I love math, I love physics, I love electricity, I love all that.
Wow.
And so I was really sad that I wouldn't work with that, because when you're a pilot, you're not an engineer, so it's not the same. Now,
did you have a path to maybe learn to be a pilot through the military? Because don't you have required military service in Switzerland? That
is correct. So it's actually what I did. So when I was 16 or 15 or 16, there was a preliminary exam that you could take, which was basically open to everybody. Mm-hmm. And the exam was a lot of psychological stuff and a little bit of logic and some math, but rather low-level math. So it was not super hard. It was more about seeing, how you thought, right?
Right.
And so I passed that. And as a result, I was actually enrolled into a preparation course for pilots, which means that I actually got my private pilot license a little bit before I had my driving license. Wow. So I was flying before I was driving, which was kind of funny. But that was, of course, small planes, right? So I was flying that into the Alps, and it was actually pretty cool. I really loved it. And so that was the preparation. So when I entered the exams to enter the Swissair school, I was actually already a pilot, which helped a lot.
Oh, right.
That said, I was never a pilot in the military, mostly because, I kind of tried and they kind of told me, hey, go there. And I said, why? And they really didn't like me asking why. And eventually I was dismissed. So they just didn't want me in a jet.
I see.
Asking questions. That was not a good combination. But it was an interesting time for sure. Definitely challenging time for sure. And so after that in the military, I was actually in the Air Force, but in the ground personnel and taking care of weather forecasts and stuff like that, which was actually pretty interesting and, not bad at all. So.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, better than, shooting and sleeping in the forest, which I did as well, but not as much as some of my friends. So.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So once you got your degree, you got sort of your first programming job, or how did that work?
So pretty much actually I did a little bit of programming when I was in engineer school, but back then it was really some Pascal, and it was mostly about controlling some devices. So really a lot of I/O and stuff like that. So basically I was doing for my diploma, right, I did some controlling, and I had kind of a model helicopter that I was controlling. It was not flying around, right? It was not it was not a drone like we have now, which is really awesome. But it was kind of, a first step in that direction. But that was really some awful programming. I had no idea what I was doing pretty much. I was just writing code and, no structure at all. And so that was kind of fun. It was a Turbo Pascal at the time, and no UI as well, nothing much. But later I was actually hired by a firm named Stefa Control System, which you guys actually might be familiar with if you walk into the Microsoft campus and you check the sensors for temperature on the wall. You still see some with the names Stefa Control System.
Interesting.
Because those were actually the systems that I was building.
Wow.
And those were a system of controllers for the for the building automation, and especially back then the temperature regulation. So I'm talking 95, 96 now. And so my first programming job was actually to do some very low-level programming in C, which was actually a dialect of C called Neuron C. It was actually an interesting job because especially the memory was extremely constrained. I think we had 64K, if I remember correctly.
Wow.
And so this was for everything. So the operating system, which was actually kind of a shell of an operating system, and also the program.
So did you didn't learn C in gymnasium or college? You picked it up for the job?
Well, so before the job, I was, not really sure how long I would be without a job, because after the Swiss Air School closed, I was pretty much thinking, okay, what do I do now, right?
Yeah.
And so, back then Java was non-existent, right? Mm-hmm. So the first language you would pick probably as an engineer, as a programmer or would-be programmer, was actually C++.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I went to do some courses during the day, which were actually paid by the unemployment office, right? And that was C++. So the very first language that I learned in a more or less structured manner was C++, and it was not object-oriented. It was just the basics of the language, right?
Sure. And then translating that back to C, it's even though they're the related languages, it's really C++ without all the object stuff.
Yeah, pretty much. And since the C++ that I learned was really very, very basic, so it was not a big deal to go back to C. But obviously, I mean, there was a huge learning curve for me because, for the first time I had to really code and see that actually working. And the thing which was interesting in that job is that and that's something which has always fascinated me as an electrical engineer, is that this program was actually doing something. It was not just, we had no UI. It was really just actuating, getting some reading from sensors and actuating some actuators based on that. And that was pretty awesome because those things were actually living. You had some relays which were actually clicking when you were executing your program, so I really liked that. Actually, it was really nice. And so I started checking how we can optimize it and work on the structure of the program and all that. And
I remember memory really carefully, since you're on
the memory was
machine.
Super critical. So at some point we had, I had a job with a client who wanted to have a special edition of our controllers. And so I went there with additional features and all that. And at some point I had to tell him, look, if you want that feature, I have to remove this feature because they cannot fit all on the chip. It's too big, So I really had to go and count the bytes. And that was pretty cool, actually. I really like that. It's something that, we tend to forget nowadays when you see, especially on phones, for example, the applications grow to huge megabytes. And it's sometimes you think, well, does it really make sense, right? It probably,
I do.
I mean,
I remember early in the Windows Phone space, and people were, talking to me about dependency injection and bringing in Unity and some other things. And I'm like, it's a phone, right? I mean, we're not.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the definition of phone, right, is a kind of harm. I mean, those are really computer and pretty magical and powerful. But yeah, it's kind of crazy. And I think it's a good school when you do this kind of really low level programming and thinking like an engineer. And that's a distinction that I make always, is that I'm not a computer scientist and I never learned algorithms. So don't ask me about algorithms. What I do is building stuff, right? And that's my job. And it's I think and nothing against computer scientists, right? It's not that. No. It's just that I think it takes both to if you want to have a successful team, you probably need a little bit of both on your team,
Absolutely.
So later, after working on C for a while, I graduated to C++. I didn't like it much. I had a project with C++, but it was still no UI, so it was still controllers, and I was kind of tired of that. And back then, at the time, I was really starting to get very much into HTML and JavaScript. And people who know me a little bit will maybe be surprised at that, but I was actually a huge fan of JavaScript at the time. So again, I'm talking, 97, 98, like this. And back then we didn't have much on the web yet, but it was really a crazy gold rush and really interesting in terms of developing for that. And so I was back then active on Usenet. Usenet was, the news groups that we had. And there was one which was called comp.lang.javascript. And so all the comp.lang were all about computer languages. And comp.lang JavaScript was pretty awesome because it was where basically we invented all the modern JavaScript that is used nowadays is pretty much coming from those days.
Yeah.
The whole discussions around prototype inheritance and the dynamism of JavaScript as opposed to other languages like Java and which back then was kind of the big brother of JavaScript, something like that.
Yeah.
The whole confusion. I loved the other day because I read, somebody made the joke about Java being to JavaScript like car is to carpet.
Right.
And actually somebody on comp.lang JavaScript came up with that joke in 98. So it's still not quite clear what JavaScript is nowadays, almost 20 years later. So that's interesting. And it was pretty cool. So what interested me back then was I think that what fascinated me in JavaScript is that it was really the only programming language that everybody had on their computers. And so nobody had to install anything. And so it was kind of the perfect path for a newbie to come to programming without having to install anything or to buy anything. And you needed like Notepad and a web browser, basically. And so my first website was actually very much centered around that, around helping people to get on board with programming through JavaScript.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it was a fun time, really. And, not very, very different from what I do now, except it was with different means and, with a different language, but really helping people to understand what they were doing and why their thing was not working. And so I started putting some of the answers that I was giving on Usenet. I was also putting them on my site because I thought, okay, maybe I need to archive that and, maybe give it a little bit more visibility.
And not have to answer it again and again.
Exactly. So I could just, send a link to people and show them that. And those were nice days. Actually, Douglas Crockford, who is now kind of the father or the grandfather, I don't know, I don't want to offend him, of JavaScript, was actually on Complang JavaScript back then. And I remember having had, multiple discussions with him around that or this topic around JavaScript. So it was fun. And my first editing job was also around JavaScript. Actually, I was asked if I wanted to review the French translation of JavaScript, the definitive guide.
Oh, nice.
Is it Flanagan? I think, right?
Yeah.
Author. And so I read the whole French translation and I made edits and stuff like that. So it was an interesting job as well.
So at what point did you join Siemens? Because that's where I think you were working when we met. I don't know how many years ago now.
Yeah, no, that's correct. Good memory. So I actually didn't join them. They acquired us. Siemens being a big multinational firm, and they wanted to be active into air conditioning. And they had one of their division doing a little bit of that, but they were not very successful. And so they decided to pretty much buy one of the most successful firm into that. And that was us, basically. So even though it was a small firm, it was actually pretty big and pretty well known in terms of the products. And so we got acquired. I forget the exact year, but it was probably around 2000, something like this. Mm-hmm. And through that, I started working for Siemens and doing more work like that. But at the time, like I said, I wanted to do UI work and, if possible, do some HTML and JavaScript professionally and not just as a hobby.
Sure.
That didn't work out very well in the beginning, but at least I was able to move to a team which was doing more UI and especially Java. And this is also around the time where I did a postgrad study in software engineering.
Oh, nice.
So my title now is really software engineer, and that was a kind of I think 1.5 year postgrad studies on the job, but evening classes and stuff like that. It was pretty intensive, and back then, of course, the main language was Java that we used, and it was fun because it was the first time that I could really feel some sense of huge community around the programming language. JavaScript was nice, but it was a small community. But Java was, back then, it was taking the world by surprise, and really
enormous.
Programmers were. Yeah, we didn't have much internet to talk on. So I remember actually calling a friend with a phone to tell him, hey, there is a new version of Java. You should download it, right? And so it was awesome to see every time we had a new JDK, what was coming and what new stuff we had. It was really an exciting time to be in programming. It is still now, but back then it was kind of different because nobody really knew what we were doing. It was really the dark ages, right? I
have a question for you that
sure.
You may or may not be able to answer. So let's see how this goes.
Right.
You're the first European developer that we've had on the show.
Oh, okay.
I could be wrong, and someone may correct me, but that's my memory. And I'm curious. You've worked with teams in the U.S. You've obviously worked a lot in Europe. Do you think that development is different in those two places? Do you think teams work in different ways, or? Obviously, it's not just language. There's more of a cultural difference. And I wonder if that bleeds down into the way development teams work together.
Yeah, I guess there is. I think, it's a little bit hard for me to answer really because every team works in a very different manner.
Sure.
And I think that really it all matters in how the teams are organized. And one thing I really don't like is what we call resource augmentation, where you basically have a team active somewhere, but suddenly, hey, we need 2 more programmers. Let's just pull 2 guys from typically from India, but it might be also from the US or another place, right? And that's really nothing and really not right against programming in India or in the US or anything, right? It's just that this way of working, in my opinion, is not very efficient, mostly because you always end up blaming the guy who's not in the room with you, right? And
there's also the problem, the Mythical Man month, I think, is where I got this. But they talked a lot about this, that you're pulling usually your top developers away to try to bring the new guys up to speed. And so you're hurting sort of the quality of the team at the same time. They described it as trying to speed up cooking an omelet by just turning up the heat.
That's correct. There is a famous saying about if you get 9 women, they can have a baby in 1 month, right?
Exactly.
So it definitely doesn't work. And the models that we have now at Identity Mind, where I work, in my opinion, is better in the sense that we also have people in India who are extremely talented and very good at what they do, but they work in the way that we are organized. They are much more. We have full teams there basically. And then we say, okay, we have designers and developers and integrators and QA, and we have the same, in the US. And so by doing that, it's easier. It's kind of paradoxical and maybe a little bit ironic that I say that, because I usually work remote on a team, right? Because being in Europe and most of my team being either in the US or in India. But of course, with people who are quite senior and with a lot of experience and all that, you can make it work. But in general, I tend to stay away from resource augmentation team, and rather, having a full-fledged team on location is better if we can have that.
Sure.
You really need to handpick the people who work from home or who work remote if you want to make it work. Anyway, it's working pretty well for us, but I started working in international teams in 2002 or 2003, something like that, when we did our first WPF. No, actually, sorry. At those days, I was doing ASP.NET. So later, I came to the international team with WPF, and that was in 2006. I was mistaken about that.
Sure.
But yeah, it was definitely an eye-opening experience having to work over the time zones, and it was a very large project. So of course, the scale of the project itself was a challenge. And it was. I mean, working across cultures is definitely a little bit difficult sometimes. But I think for me, the thing which is always surprising is that the work culture is really different in the US than here. I guess that's really the biggest difference, but I don't really notice that in my day-to-day work. It's more around the work. Like, when you talk, somebody can be here one day and they are gone the next day, right? Because you guys have just a few days notice, and with vacation time and all that, suddenly you get a call and somebody tells you, hey, by the way, today is my last day, right? And this is something which here is very unusual and pretty foreign. Actually, we typically have weeks or often months notice before we, from the moment we give our notice to the moment we actually change. So transitions are much easier to handle, et cetera, et cetera.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's different. But personally, I love the difference. I strive on it. I really like it. So I guess, it's working fine for me. Yeah.
Where in your career did you sort of transition from, an individual contributor to someone who is helping lead or even run teams? When did that happen? Was that something you did on purpose, or did that fall in your lap?
So, on the first job that I did, right, which was this controller programming in C, it was really pretty much a one-man job. Yeah. I mean, the development part was a one-man job. We had a team made of, hardware people, because everything was made, custom made, right? Mm-hmm. So we had the hardware designers, we had some testers, we had all kinds of things. We had, of course, people who were designing that and all that. So there was a small team, and at this time, after, I don't know exactly when it was, but at some point I took over one of the projects, which was, making a new family of those devices. And it was kind of my first experience as a project leader or project manager, I guess. Project leader is a direct translation from German, which is Projektleiter. But, I guess in English, you're more politically correct than that, and you say project manager, right? Anyway, and so that was kind of my first experience, and honestly, I didn't like it much, mostly because I'm really a coder. That's really what I do, and the whole worrying about deadlines and money was really not my thing. But it was kind of the first experience. But later, what I did when I did my first ASP.NET project professionally, so as I said, I had quite an extensive experience with HTML, JavaScript, and the first ASP.NET project we did was actually with ASP.NET 1.1. So we were, relatively early in ASP.NET already. And it was really a full-blown client, which was able to control buildings or group of buildings. And that was, everything was made in HTML and JavaScript. And we didn't call it single page application, but in a sense, it is what it was.
Sure.
Which, again, right, all those concepts kind of go in circles, because back then we had exactly those issues, which were, how do you preserve state, for example, and stuff like that, right? And so that was an interesting phase. And since I had this JavaScript and HTML experience, I took over the, I guess you would call it the technical team lead or something like that. On the client side. So we had people worrying about the server and especially offering, the building as a service.
Right.
Back then we were using SOAP, and it was not even WCF. It was called .NET Remoting, which was kind of the grandfather of WCF, right? And we had, the funny thing is that we were actually connecting to that through JavaScript. So we were using XML HTTP requests. And back then there was nothing to wrap that. I mean, this was before jQuery, right? You have to understand that.
Yeah.
So we had to wrap everything and write everything ourselves. And I literally wrote a JavaScript component, which was actually parsing the SOAP codes, which is XML, as you know.
Yeah.
And that was no fun, because SOAP is, it's very extensive and very big. And unfortunately, there was no other way back then. Microsoft kind of had a component which was doing that. But we tested it and we found some huge memory leaks. And so as one of my first interaction with Microsoft, I called the guys in Munich, which was our Microsoft office. And I told them, well, look, we tested your thing, but we found some memory leaks, and we sent them a repro. And the result was pretty fast, actually. 1 week later, the thing was marked unsupported, and eventually they deprecated it.
So you're the reason why no one can use it anymore.
I blame Siemens for that, but yeah, when Siemens was coughing, Microsoft was definitely getting sick. So, and that's probably still the case. So yeah, it never worked, and so eventually we had to do everything pretty much manually. And so I took over that team, the client side team, and I taught HTML and JavaScript to the guys. And it's funny because the other day I dug up the JavaScript guidelines that we actually wrote at the time. And my boss allowed me to put them online, on my website back then, because I thought it would be interesting to share that with the world, because we came up with a few interesting ideas on how to make the dynamic language a little bit more static, so that it would be easier, by having rules at least, to run it through JSLint eventually and all that. But again, right, it was pre-story pretty much, so we had to invent all that. It was kind of fun, but especially managing the team at the time was pretty cool. I liked that because it was not a project management task, but it was more of a technical team task, and that was technical team lead task, and that was fun, really.
So I liked it. Mentoring than managing.
Exactly. That is exactly correct. And teaching and training people and, code reviews and all that. So yeah, that was more of my kind of management style. I like that. And later, when we started the next project, which was my first XAML project, my first WPF project, basically the big breakthrough for me is that I was at the time a little bit unsatisfied with the job because, the ASP.NET project was ending. And after pretty much 2 or 3 years of working on that, it was, a little bit tired and thinking of wanting to see something else. And, like I said, right, the story is a story of luck as well. But basically, I was pretty much sent to Mix 2006 to go and check out this new XAML stuff, right?
Oh, cool.
That was pretty cool. It was kind of, oh my God, And it was my first trip to the US for a very long time as well. I mean, I had been to the US before, but only in vacation. So pretty much first business trip as well. And going to, to the Venetian, and I was upgraded to a suite. I had like a obscene suite with, with the jacuzzi next to my bed and
nice.
Crazy stuff. And then I was in the room for the keynote. It was Bill Gates, which was also particular. And when I saw XAML and Blend, I thought, well, okay, that's what I want, because one of the big challenges that we had with the HTML, especially back then, is that I was never able to give to the designers what they wanted.
Right.
And that was always a huge frustration for me, especially, cross-platform thing and, going from back then we had Netscape and IE, right? And on Netscape, it never worked. And well, he was kind of crazy. So eventually, I saw XAML, I tried Blend, and I got crazy for that. And I came back to Switzerland. I decided, okay, that's really what I want. And we spent about a year, doing tests and prototypes and all kinds of things with WPF and seeing if it was able to fulfill, our needs for the next project. And the answer ended up being yes. And so we started working with that actually as the first team at Siemens doing production WPF, which luckily for me caught Microsoft's attention quite fast. They were really eager to hear our feedback. And so I started going to Redmond and talking to them. And once I entered the room and Scott Gu was there and asked me questions about WPF, and it was pretty cool. The whole Blend team also, I wrote to one of the guys on the Blend team, Christian Schorman. He's not unfortunately on Blend anymore, but he was really leading the whole Blend effort. And we started, communicating, and I told him, well, if you want, I can sit down with you next time I'm in Redmond and show you, problems I have, right? And he said, yeah, sure. And so I expected kind of a one-on-one meeting. And when I entered the room, the whole Blend team was there. And there was probably 20 people in that room. And they basically wanted to hear, oh my God, there is somebody out there using Blend in production. Let's hear what he has to say, right?
Yeah, especially
that was
probably the large scale you were doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was cool. And back then, one of the things I wanted to do is improve the designer developer workflow as much as possible. And so we asked Microsoft for guidance on that, and they directed us to Identity Mine, which was one of the leading and still is actually one of the leading firms in the XAML space. And I sat down with one of their guys, and we pretty much decompiled Blend to understand how Blend is working and how we can hook up objects into Blend and basically create design time data. And that was pretty much the start of the whole MVVM story, back then. And I sat down with the architects of WPF, like John Gossman and Ted who back then was still at Microsoft, and Mark Feinholz and all those guys who had really designed WPF from the ground up. And this is when I started learning about, MVVM and how the whole thing was. So Gossman is the guy who coined the term MVVM, So those guys really knew what they were talking about, and it was really an interesting time to be in that field for sure.
Absolutely, that's a very varied career. I think most of us think of you as the WPF guy, but I found it interesting how you spent all that time in the HTML space, and that sort of informed you coming to WPF.
Yeah, it's true. And the thing I like the most about, when I look back into my career is that I touched really a a lot of languages. I mean, I didn't mention it, but I did work in VB as well, VB6 back then, like pretty much everybody who did any UI on Windows,
Absolutely.
right? VBA extensively because we had some crazy stuff that I had to take care of, and C, C++, and the whole ASP.NET thing from the start. And I did some WinForms. I didn't like it, and so I did just one small project on that just to see what it was like. But eventually, I was really happy when something else came up.
Sure.
And so, and also the whole Java and JavaScript experience where basically back then, I mean, I had not touched the PC, Windows PC before I was probably 26, 27. Before that, I had Apple Macintosh. And it's kind of funny because nowadays I wouldn't touch an Apple device with chopsticks, right? But it's more because I'm not a big fan of the firm, and especially not of Jobs. That's more personal problems that I have.
You're not alone.
I keep saying whenever Windows Phone will be number one, I'm probably going to move to whatever is the underdog of then. Because back then, when I was on Apple Macintosh, people were looking at me and saying, "Are you crazy? Nobody's using that." And so that was, I'm always on the wrong side of the fence for some reason, but whatever.
Well, I think we have some time before Windows Phone takes over, so.
Yeah, I'm probably safe for a while. Yeah,
for a little while.
Well, in Europe, I was in Italy over Easter, and I was in line to go to the Vatican and to the museum, and I was just next to a lady who was using a Lumia 625. And so I asked her, "Oh, so what phone is that?" Because at first I didn't recognize it, and she showed me, and I said, "Oh yeah, cool, okay." And then we started talking, and I showed her the the 8.1 update on my phone, and she was quite excited about the notification center and stuff. But basically, my point being that this was an absolutely non-geek who was using a Lumia just next to me, and in Italy they are pretty successful.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's definitely a hybrid ecosystem to be sure. I mean, I'm sure we won't have a one player anytime soon, and I probably don't want to have just one player anyway.
Of course. Mm-hmm. Well, it's been great talking to you.
Yeah, you too. Absolutely.
Enjoy the evening over there in Switzerland, and I will see you soon.
Awesome.